It's always fun to get to come back, and it has been a few years since I left K-State, but I did get to spend some time at the stocker unit because I always look for every opportunity to help grad students work cattle instead of being in the lab working on my project. So it's awesome to see how Dale and his crew has continued to grow this unit and continues to support student success in serving the industry. So it's a great opportunity to be here, and I'm excited to talk to you today about work I'm doing with Kemin. So I am a technical consultant for Kemin, and like Tyler mentioned earlier today, Kemin is the best kept secret in the beef business. So if you look over here to your left at these beautiful signs that our lovely marketing manager made, you may or may not recognize the molecules that are represented by the information provided on those. And I get the honor of talking you through their implementation and application. And we're really at a great point in time on the beef team within Kemin, because we spent years learning about how each of these compounds works and how to best implement them to help cattle overcome resilience during times of stress. The Economist outlined the great risk in owning cattle right now, and it's safe to say the most predictable event in owning live animals is the unpredictability and the stressors that cattle face throughout their lifetime. Some are planned and some are unplanned. The common thread between each of the interventions that we're going to talk through today is their ability to help cattle become more resilient to the metabolic and physiological states of stress that they endure, whether it's environmental stress, a social stress like weaning, commingling, or transportation, or even metabolic stressors that we place on them with our current production practices. So with that said, we're gonna go a lot of different directions. So you can't take a nap after lunch, all right? Because I'm gonna lose you really fast. But we're going to talk about trace mineral nutrition relative to chemtrace chromium propionate. Then we're gonna spend quite a bit of time talking on the concept of intestinal health and the intestinal health therapy Clostat. And then we'll wrap up with two interventions that we have that can help with environmental toxins. I know we're a little bit on the edge of the fescue belt, but fescue toxicosis is a huge problem for stocker operators in that fescue belt, as well as the routine molds and mycotoxins that come in our forages and feeds at different times and handling practices throughout operation. So as we begin, like I said, we're gonna talk about a lot of different subject matter. And we're going to start talking about trace mineral nutrition. So when you think trace minerals, your mind goes to copper, zinc, and manganese. Chromium falls in that bucket as being an essential nutrient and trace element. If any of you take care of diabetic folks, you might recognize that chromium would be a component of supplements that diabetic people would take for its ability to offset insulin resistance. And it's doing the same thing in a beef animal. And you think, well, beef cattle don't become insulin resistant. I'm going to talk to you about the stages of production and where insulin resistance comes to play and can be detrimental to their health and performance. And when we have chromium in the diet, it helps the animal withstand those stress events that are creating insulin resistance. Chromium is unique from a trace mineral standpoint because it's a heavy metal that had to gain FDA clearance. So it wasn't until 2009 that chromium was approved for use in cattle diets. And to date, chromium propionate remains the only FDA-approved source of use of chromium in beef diets in the US. As we talk about how chromium works biologically, I'm not going to get too far in the weeds in this cartoon, but I want you to know the interaction between glucose, which is providing that animal energy, and how it's taken up predominantly by skeletal muscle tissue, which equates to carcass weight, as well as adipose tissue. And so these tissues all use an insulin-dependent glucose uptake mechanism. Well, in an insulin-resistant case, these receptors don't work very well, and the glucose, which is represented by the red circles, is not taken up very efficiently by that cell for use for production. When chromium is available in that animal for use by that receptor can work longer and be stronger and allow for increased glucose uptake by the formation of what I call glucose shuttles that the cell makes that come to the cell surface to pull glucose in. So, long story short, chromium stabilizes the insulin receptor and allows for more efficient utilization of glucose that the animal has consumed from their feed. If we think about where efficiency of glucose utilization comes into play, it is very heightened during our periods of stress. And if you look at this laundry list of stressors that beef cattle you all endure, you all deal with them in your day-to-day operations. And they are costly from a performance standpoint as well as a health standpoint. And so any type of, I'll use the term risk management tool, from a dietary intervention that you can put in to help cattle withstand those stress periods really should warrant your attention in terms of keeping those cattle healthy and gaining and performing optimally. Again, the disease risks and the health risks are huge in beef production, and we have to manage through those in our day-to-day basis. We know a lot about how chromium works across all segments of the industry or of production. I'm going to talk about the receiving period and the finishing period specifically, but you'll see our chromium sign on the wall. We do have a cow-calf data set that shows great responses with chromium supplementation during reproduction. And so if you have more questions about that, the Kimman folks around here are happy to help answer that. But for the sake of content today, I'm going to focus on the receiving period and the finishing period. Hands down, that backgrounding receiving period is one of the most stressful times during the fed cattle lifespan, and you expect to have health issues during that time. And the reason is obviously all the stressors we talked about, but that sickness and disease pressure creates a tremendous glucose need for that animal's immune system. The immune system takes a tremendous amount of glucose to perform and function and be fueled, which sacrifices energy from the animal for performance. And when we add chromium into the diet, earlier work that we did when we first gained approval for use of chromium with high-risk feeder cattle, you can kind of look at the bar graph across here as we had increasing levels of chromium in the diet. Average daily gain in feed efficiency increased in a linear fashion during a 56-day finishing period. And we also evaluated health outcomes during that same time period. And there was an 18% percentage point reduction in the number of cattle treated at least once when chromium was added in the diet. So what's happening is those cattle create a cortisol response to stress. The immune system gets activated, and the immune system needs glucose. That cortisol spike creates insulin resistance, and chromium's helping not only pull in all of the available glucose, but also help that animal use that in the most efficient way. From an immune system standpoint, in that same study, we took a subset of animals and challenged them with LPS, which is a very strong pathogenic challenge. And the outcome was that the chromium supplemented steers had a higher cytokine response, which shows their immune system is working harder than the control steers, and so they're able to deal with that disease pressure to a greater extent than the control steers. To support the data that I just presented, we did a follow-up receiving study at West Texas A&M with very high-risk feeder cattle. They weighed about 500 pounds or 480 coming in. They would have been received from sale barns in South and Central Texas. They were over 21% BRD morbid on top of metaphylaxis. When we added chromium, in this case, there wasn't a performance response, but what we did see was a reduction in the number of cattle treated at least once with the chromium supplementation over control. So showing that consistency of response with reducing BRD morbidity and mortality and having a health effect with the addition of chromium. If we move beyond the receiving phase, and again, it's easier to see the stress response during the receiving phase and understand where a tool like chromium may fit during that part of the operation. Thinking about including chromium throughout the finishing phase also has a lot of merit. As cattle are on feed for a longer period of time, the proportion of fat to lean starts to change, and increasing adiposity decreases insulin sensitivity. We kind of create four-legged diabetics, if you will. And so adding chromium throughout the finishing period helps offset that change in body composition and the environmental events that may be happening if there are heat stress events, especially while those cattle are on feed. If we look at where chromium fits throughout the finishing period, and the light may prevent this from showing up real effectively. If you remember back to the schematic I showed you with how chromium was working and those shuttles that were being drawn up to the cell surface, we were able to measure that in the actual longissimus muscle tissue of beef steers. And so on the top would have been samples from the steers at day 0. And this particular set of cattle were on feed for 147 days. And on the bottom would be the 147-day treatments. On the left-hand side are the control cattle that did not receive chromium. And on the right-hand side are the cattle that were fed chromium. And what's interesting, if you look down at 147 days and see these fluorescent-shaped images, those are those glucose shuttles or glucose transporters that are showing up on the cell surface when chromium's around. When there is no chromium, they're very faint. So we're increasing the abundance and the activity of the glucose transporters that can then help those cattle as their longer days on feed to offset the insulin resistance that's occurring with increasing adiposity. Live performance and carcass performance work around the addition of chromium, work done at CSU with yearling steers, and the addition of chromium. We have increases in final body weight and average daily gain with the addition of chromium, and then an 8 kilo roughly difference in carcass weight with the addition of chromium in the diet. And just to follow up and support that work, another piece of literature done at Colorado State with or without chromium supplementation in the same model of animal, just a yearling steer, increased average daily gain as well as carcass weight kind of at that 8 kilo mark with the addition of chromium over control. And to wrap up the chromium conversation, this would be a chart looking at carcass weight responses when chromium is supplemented. So if we were to pick a variable like carcass weight and look at a trace mineral like zinc and put the responses on a graph, I would venture to say those results are going to be highly variable. If you just glance at this slide and notice most of the results are very positive. So from a carcass weight response, when we look at the weighted average, so accounting for the number of animals represented in these studies, we have a 3.9 pound improvement in carcass weight. We have done some large pen studies and get around a 2.3 pound improvement in carcass weight with the addition of chromium supplementation. So consistent responses around carcass weight growth by feeding chromium. So with that, we're going to take a deep breath and we're going to pivot to the left because we're going to talk about intestinal health. So, our trace mineral product portfolio, we have more than just chromium, but we focus on chromium solely. And as a beef team, we're very heavily invested in understanding what intestinal health is and what it means to the beef industry. So the field of intestinal health is very new. When I was in school, we in ruminant nutrition didn't learn a lot about what's happening past the ruminal tract. But after I talk to you about intestinal health today, I think you'll realize just what the extent of that tract means for the animal and how it's important in systematic health. As we think about gut health in animal science, it has become synonymous with animal health. This field of knowledge has rapidly evolved over the past 10 to 15 years, and we continue to add more information, about like what a stress event does at the intestinal level and how that then turns into a systemic health problem for the animal. We think about what the GI tract is just in general. It is a self-enclosed tract that runs from the mouth to the anus, and everything inside of that tract is technically outside of the body. What's alarming is just the size and the surface area of the intestinal tract of a beef animal. This would just be the small and large intestine of a 600-pound Holstein heifer that's laid out on a lab floor. Its length is 120 feet, and its diameter is the size of a golf ball. If we think of a 1,500-pound feedlot steer and what the surface area of that tract would equate to, if we were to, lay out that tract in its entirety, the range is 15,000 to 30,000 square feet. So for perspective, a 100-head feed yard pen is 30,000 square feet. That's a tremendous amount of area that the body has to protect and defend from acids, pathogens, and toxins on a very consistent, continual basis. If we think about further what the role of that tract is, you think about the GI tract and you think about nutrient absorption. Of course, that's its predominant function from an energetic standpoint. But because that tract is so big and so vulnerable to penetration, over 70% of the immune system resides in that tract. And the commensal microbial community that lives there is very important in helping keep that immune system robust and that tract intact. Just to give you a perspective of how vulnerable that tract is, on the left side of this slide would be just the cellular makeup of the rumen. Most of you realize how thick and tough a rumen wall is, and of course that's by design. That rumen has to be an anaerobic controlled fermentation vat that the contents don't spill out of in order for rumen fermentation to happen optimally. If we contrast that to what's happening in the intestinal tract, there are only 2 mucosal layers and 1 epithelial cell layer. And again, that's of course by design because we have to get small particles of carbohydrates and proteins efficiently from inside the tract to the bloodstream. But the flip side of that is this tract is very vulnerable to all of the bad guys that are floating in circulation that can attack it, damage it, and infiltrate it. To elaborate on that a little bit more and to pull in where the commensal bacterial population lies within that role of stabilizing that intestinal tract, if we don't have a healthy commensal population, which are these purple squiggles here, you see that the mucosal layers go away, these epithelial cells begin to be displaced, and these red guys are the bad guys, the E. coli's, the Clostridias, the Salmonellas of the world, that then have the opportunity to come in, set up shop, and truly damage that intestinal lining and wreak havoc systemically on that animal. If we think about what's doing that from just a practical common sense day-to-day world, we're talking at the intestinal level, but then where's it manifesting in the animal? It would be all the stressors that cattle are faced with, whether That's dietary related from subacute acidosis with continual feeding of high carb diets. If there are mold or mycotoxin insults, of course, from a disease and pathogen standpoint, that challenge the microflora and the barrier. And then finally, we think about all of those physical and psychological stressors that our management practices placed on cattle. Those create, again, a cortisol spike that can be detrimental at that epithelial level. We even think about things like feed restriction or low feed intake periods causing problems at the epithelial level. I'm going to show you evidence of that. If you look at this cross-section of small intestinal tissue, this would look at cows that were either fed all that they wanted on the left side, so ad libitum, or 40% of what they were able to eat. And if we kind of compare and contrast what's happening just from a visual standpoint, those cows that were getting all that they wanted, they've got greater blood flow to those villi. So the villi in the intestinal tract are what are important for helping take up nutrients efficiently and effectively. And when they look less like finger-like projections and more like columns, they become less viable. So you can see that happening when the cow is even just allowed 40% of her ad libitum intake. If you think of when that might be happening in the life of a beef steer, when they are weaned and shipped and then placed on feed, of course there's a big dip in feed intake from the time they left the ranch or their original point of origin to the new yard that they're in. If we have a re-implant period, there's usually a decrease in feed intake for a period of time. And they do recover from lower feed intake and adapt. But this just goes to show you that, that old adage that cattle like boring and cattle like consistency. And when we fail to provide them boring and consistency, things start unraveling, and it really happens at the gut level. And that's why, when we have disruptions in their normal day-to-day routines, we see the stress events show up in them physically and metabolically. To elaborate on that, this would be the effects of heat stress on the intestinal layer. This is actually pig data because it's easier to induce heat stress in pigs than it is in cattle, and sacrifice pigs for their intestinal stress in cattle. But same story. On the left-hand side, no heat stress, and on the right-hand side, pigs that endured heat stress. And you can see those intestinal villi are really starting to just be almost non-functional because they're deteriorating because of the stress response from heat stress. So hopefully I provided a little bit of evidence from a visual physiological standpoint around how stress manifests itself at the gut level in beef animals. If we take it a bit further, you look over here at our closed-stat banner and it says we're reducing BRD incidence. Well, BRD doesn't happen in the intestine, so how are we having a systemic effect of BRD at the lung level if we're using an intestinal health tool? So I'm sure you all have seen popular press articles on the human side, linking gut health to happiness, immunity, cognitive ability, and the laundry list of factors that go along with human well-being. It's safe to say the same is happening in our livestock production animals. And as we've learned more on the gut health side, our systems are all interrelated. And there is carryover of not only the good bacteria from the gut to the lung, but also the products that they make. And so if we have a strong, robust commensal bacterial population at the gut level, we have a good chance we're going to keep the problems at the lung level moderated. We're never going to be 100% at being successful at mitigating respiratory sickness. But if we are able to use what the gut can provide from a metabolic standpoint, we can have an effect at the lung level. And again, that's through the metabolites that the bacteria produce as well as the bacteria themselves. And so we know, this is all happening because we're lowering inflammation from the metabolites that the bacteria make, and then that we're strengthening that lung immune response through that interaction. And so hopefully that's got you excited into thinking about risk management tools for BRD management or health management in your operations, and those taking place at the intestinal barrier level. And so the tools that are in the gut health space truly focus on maintaining intestinal barrier function and keeping that commensal bacterial community robust. And we'll talk then about the active microbial clostat that we have been working with on the beef side for almost 10 years now. So we know a lot about how it works and where it works for our customers and producers that use it. The background of clostat is really very unique. So in the early 90s, there was a massive outbreak of necrotic enteritis in a chicken house in Singapore, and most of the birds died, but a few lived. And so the question was then, what was unique to those live birds that the dead birds didn't have? This led to a very aggressive intestinal tissue screening process that discovered that the live birds had the active microbial, or the bug, if you will, Bacillus subtilis PD6 in their intestine, and the dead birds did not. And so the uniqueness about this particular microbial is that it was derived from an animal, not from the soil, not from a plant derivative, but truly from an animal. The way that clostat or Bacillus subtilis PD6 works, and the reason we know it works in the gut or the GI tract is that it requires the low pH and bile salts of the abomasum to be activated. So it's spore forming, which means it needs to be fed every day. It's not going to colonize and grow on its own. But at the same time, it's inert. When we add it to a diet, it's not going to activate and lose efficacy by the time that it enters the animal. And so it's very easy to handle and stable to handle from that standpoint. We know a lot about how clostat works in the animal. Because it's a very strong Clostridia antagonist, it has the ability to stop growth of Clostridial organisms. And we can show how it just lyses the cell or damages the cell wall of Clostridia bacteria. It also has the ability to lower overall systemic inflammation, and through the metabolites it produces, it can keep populations of E. coli and salmonellas at levels in the gut that aren't damaging to the animal. So those pathogens that are harbored in our guts, in animals' guts, don't become a problem unless they reach a certain population threshold. So through metabolites that clostat produces when the spore is activated, it doesn't allow those bad actors to grow in the animal, and that's through a pathway called quorum quenching. Excuse me. So we started work on the cattle side with clostat, looking at its efficacy in the face of a salmonella challenge. This is a powerful data set from a salmonella mitigation standpoint. The bottom line in this study was that we had calves that were either fed clostat or not, and then either subject to a salmonella challenge or not. And what we learned with the two dark lines, the line on top, oh no, Tim, push the button. Okay, got it. So the dark line on top would be those calves that were not fed salmonella and challenged, or not fed clostat and challenged with salmonella. And you'll see they mounted a very large rectal temperature response. They got pretty dang sick for a fairly prolonged period of time. And then this other dark line would be the salmonella challenged calves that were fed clostat. They did not reach that rectal temperature threshold and didn't get as sick as those non-supplemented calves. And the reason for that was, so we euthanized all the cattle in this study and looked at tissues from the rumen to the rectum. And this would be colonization of salmonella. And we'll focus just on those intestinal tissues, the duodenum and the jejunum. And the red bars would be the Clostat supplemented treatment. Black bars are controlled. So you can see there's virtually no salmonella in that upper 2/3 of that intestinal tract when Clostat's in the diet. So from a salmonella standpoint, there's very effective control in the face of a salmonella issue or a salmonella challenge. As we move on to learn about how Clostat has application in the fed cattle world, we did our initial study at Oklahoma State, and the kind of background of this study, that Sparks facility had been vacant for 6 months before we did the study, so the pens were fairly naive when the cattle came in, and the cattle were not very high risk. But even with not having a high disease pressure or a high disease load, we were still able to see a tendency for an improvement in feed efficiency with the addition of Clostat over control. And from the health standpoint, though it's not statistically different, there was a 33% reduction in BRD morbidity with the addition of Clostat compared with control. As we evaluated Clostat further and looked at it from a receiving standpoint, this would be the same study I talked about with chromium, but just focusing on the Clostat treatment. So this is 56-day data. And again, these are the really high-risk cattle that came from Central and South Texas. The Clostat cattle gained nearly 1/2 pound more than control. They ate nearly 1 pound more of dry matter. They were healthier and they felt better. And then if we look at our health events, we had a 21% reduction in BRD incidence. And oh my gosh, we reduced case fatality by 3%. You know where I keep something. Okay. I will just push the red button. So very strong health data and performance data in the face of a strong BRD challenge in this receiving period. Of course, we have to take our work to a large pen setting and understand how our innovations work in the real world. The work I'll present to you represents yearling cattle that weighed around 750 pounds on arrival. And we would have used, again, the large pen setting. When we added Clostat to the diet, I'm looking at this from a deads and removals included basis. I'll share the health data with you in just a minute because we did have a health response. But what's interesting is that we were able to improve performance with the addition of Clostat over control when we accounted for the cattle that were sick or that died being in that data set and dragging down the overall performance load. Similar story if we keep the deads and removals in from a carcass weight gain standpoint. For simplicity's sake, we just had more red meat to sell with with more finished cattle reaching the rail than being taken out as realizers or that would have died. And the reason for all of that is because of the health response that we saw in this particular study. So there was a 23% reduction in overall morbidity and a 28% reduction in BRD first pulls with the addition of Clostat. That resulted in, from a mortality standpoint, we had 20 more cattle to sell in the Clostat treatment than in the control treatment. So we had a difference, a reduction in mortality by feeding Clostat and a reduction in morbidity with the addition of Clostat. If we look at the dollars and cents of this and look at the closeout data just from a cowboy math perspective, so this would be live weight based figures on this particular chart. The realizers would have been assigned cull cow value. This particular work was published in 2022, and so the cull cow value would have stayed the same as what was in the published literature. But for perspective, we use today's cattle prices, and factoring in live prices to keep things simple and not getting lost in the confoundedness that can come with grid pricing and all the different grid scenarios. We just worked with live pricing. We factored in the cost of clostat throughout the finishing period. Today we would return nearly $100,000 to that feed yard with the addition of clostat, or about $85 a head net return with the addition of clostat, because we are offsetting that morbidity and mortality that those cattle are facing with the addition of this innovation. So from a summary standpoint, we've got very repeatable data from a BRD reduction perspective, around 21 to 33% BRD reduction with the addition of clostat. We have a very strong impact on lowering pathogen prevalence. Again, E. coli, salmonellas, clostridias that live and harbor in our cattle's environments, as well as bolstering feed yard profitability. And it's a very simple technology to implement. We can handle it as a feedstuff and add it either through a micro machine or just in a TMR, depending on how the yards are set up. And it's very stable within our normal environmental temperatures. So we really love working with and teaching people about intestinal health. And then it's kind of when the magic happens is when they decide to try it and they realize the effects that it's having, and it makes the work that we do very fulfilling from an innovation standpoint in the field of intestinal health. We're going to spend the next bit of this presentation talking about environmental toxin mitigation and a couple of tools that we have in our learning further application around mitigating those environmental toxins. The first tool is an enhanced zeolite. So you think about a binder, and in this case, thinking about fescue toxicity, this particular compound can also bind molds like zearalenone. But the way that it works is it's kind of like a crystalline structure that can attract positively charged molecules that are small. So a lot of our molds and toxins contain a positive charge, and traps them in that crystalline structure. And then it passes through the animal and never interacts or interfaces with the animal. So it would be reducing or lowering that environmental toxin load that they may be facing depending on that particular substance that we're talking about. This work I'm presenting is published in Professional Animal Science or Applied Animal Science. And it's just kind of the proof of concept of this compound working in a fescue toxicity environment. So this would be just metabolism work that was done. We are doing a stalker study with this particular compound in the coming years to understand if this application holds true in an applied setting. But what would have happened is that cattle would have either not been fed calcium or would have had calcium included in the face of being fed alkaloids, fescue seeds that contain various alkaloids. So there's a laundry list of alkaloids that are culprits in fescue toxicosis. And so we measured a few of them in the face of adding calcium in the diet. And so for example, one of those is ergovaline. And when we had calcium in the diet, there was more ergovaline in the feces. So if you remember how calcium works, it binds that toxin or binds that ergot derivative. And so we're keeping more of it out of the animal when calcium is around than not. Two others, ergocine and ergocornine, also tend to be higher in the feces with the addition of calcium compared with control. Finally, the reason that, if we have fescue toxicity, especially in pregnant animals and affecting pregnancy, is because fescue toxicosis affects the dopamine receptor. So we see changes in serum prolactin concentrations. So serum prolactin concentrations maintained a greater level with the addition of calcium compared with control. And so this work really, gave us some good confidence that We may have a fescue mitigation technology on our hands. We need to go out and explore it and prove it in application. But the metabolic work is very promising and very strong, leaning towards having an applied application. And then finally, I'm going to talk about our mold inhibitors really briefly. We have a product called Ultra Curb. It comes in a dry form or a liquid form. If you think about molds forming either in really, really wet rations or if we have stored feed for a long period of time, they really change the feed integrity and the diet integrity of what you're feeding your animal and can have effects on health and performance of those animals. Some of the mold inhibiting products would just be a single acid base. And so this would show what's happening with just single acids in the face of wild yeast and then several different mold types. So you can see we have acetic acid, propionic acid, and sorbic acid. One of those alone doesn't solve all of the mold and yeast issues. We have to have a combination, and that's what Ultra Curb is a proprietary acid blend that can work multifactorially at solving the wild yeast and mold problems that may be arising in our bunks or in our feed piles. Just data supporting that. So this graph of growth would be mycotoxin growth, and when we have Ultra Curb in the diet, this orange line, we kind of plateau and stop that mold forming compared with other variations of products that we would have tested in this particular piece of work. So just to let you know, we do have a mold inhibiting portfolio, and it's longer standing than any of the other innovations that I talked to you about. We did mold inhibition long before we got into the more exciting work. So with that, I hope I've given you a few items to chew on from just a systemic health standpoint, realizing the economic impact of health on your operations, and you're letting you know there are innovations that can help cattle become more resilient in the face of the inevitable and predictable stressors that they're going to face throughout their lifetime. So with that, I really appreciate your time. And if you have any questions, I'll entertain those. Oh, I should mention, I failed to mention, where do you get these products? They are available through your normal feed distributors and feed channels, all right? I failed to mention that earlier. Yeah.
When you were doing the feedlot trials, was that at a wide variety of different feed yards and treatment protocols, or were they all in one place with similar treatment protocols, or what did that look like?
Good question. So we did multiple studies at different locations, and they all had their own SOPs for pulls and treatments. We wouldn't have given them an SOP for sickness and pull rate. We just relied on their normal SOP for their operation. Question.
Thank you, Dr. Trojan. So my question concerns the chromium procreate product. So if I'm understanding you correctly, it behaves basically like metformin for type 2 diabetic patients. Is that accurate? So for a feedlot, if they wanted to try to target a phase of the finishing period where the animal is more susceptible to type 2 diabetes, and if they used percent empty body fat as proxy, at what point does that finishing animal kind of cross that threshold where their risk for becoming a type 2 diabetic goes up, exponentially?
It's a good question, and there is some data around that, looking at like where they're at insulin rise from like 40 days on feed to 147 days on feed, and kind of by that like 100-day mark, that insulin resistance or area under the curve of glucose uptake really changes and differentiates, and signaling that insulin resistance is happening even at 100 days on feed. But that's a good question. So the tricky part with like target feeding, the animal doesn't store chromium to a great extent. So the daily supplementation and the building up will help them manage through that to a greater degree than kind of phase feeding overall. Cost per head per day is around a penny a head a day. Don't quote me on that, depending on where you're at. Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Trojan.